So I'm an advisor and consultant and writer on digital strategy, focusing largely on human rights and open government. Longtime collaborator with Michael Jarvis on several projects in the natural resource sector, and more recently in these questions of transparency, technology, and storytelling. Very happy to be here and very familiar with the work of Accountable Now and like it very much. So we're going to tell you a little bit about the genesis of this report, the story behind the story, and our exploration into how donors and grantees use storytelling, starting with the transparency and accountability space where TAI is focused, and also we think providing some general lessons about the nature of story and the use of the information that may or may not be a story and may or may not count as results and impacts in our work. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to give you some of the bigger context.
Great. Thank you, Jed, and thanks for all of you for joining. I appreciate the invitation from Accountable Now. And so I'm just going to briefly touch on where this interest came from our donor members and how stories and stories of failure in particular matter to them. So just for information, as outlined on that slide, we are a donor collaborative. So we have 6 members, 5 foundations, and also the UK Development Agency, who had an interesting perspective of a government funder in contrast to philanthropy. And I would say that since I joined TAI a little over 2 years ago, there's been a growing interest in both the power of storytelling and a willingness to solicit and unpack failures, both within the donors themselves, but also with grantees. I think that's partly born out of a recognition that their reporting systems only get you so far. They've tended to focus on quantitative results, narrative reports that sit on shelves and perhaps not best utilized. It's part of a bigger trend, I think, amongst the funding community. So we're seeing, for example, this year alone, I've been to events of a grouping of media funders, also a grouping of environmental funders, where their sole focus of those convenings was around doing a better job of storytelling. And that certainly wouldn't have been the case a few years ago. And there are some interesting approaches being tried, different media, everything from as far as virtual reality films through to still some much more basic media and use of tradition, going back to radio, and it's all about what's fit for purpose. But that interest is there and is cross-cutting. I think this piece on failure is particularly interesting for TAI members, partly because we've been pushed to focus more on grant-making practices. So how can we do a better job of supporting grantees and organizations at the front lines of fighting for transparency and accountability around the world? And that means that we need to understand where things go wrong, and they may be failings which the funders could help address. They could be failings directly attributable to the funders, or they could be things that are due to circumstances beyond the grantee's control. But there's a collective interest to better understand that, knowing that they also, there's always an internal pressure, just as there is amongst the fund groups to showcase the wins and the dynamics that Jed will talk to a little bit more that might work against talking to things where things have gone wrong in a frank way. But my view, and I think it's shared by our leadership from our 6 members, is that particularly on the philanthropic space, if you are not able to surface failures from your grants, then you're probably doing something wrong, because you should be taking risks. You want to be more at the cutting edge. So if everything comes back suggesting that they've been fully effective, then that suggests that you're not sufficiently risk-taking. But at the same time, it's hard to surface those failures. It's hard to analyze them in a way that doesn't feel threatening. And that was one of the motivations for digging in on this process of generating stories and sharing stories that Jed is going to talk to that led to the report that he led on. I'll just end by saying I think there's no magic formula at this point. We've started to try a few things, like following on this report, we just did a training last week for our members on a particular way of surfacing stories, which for some of you may be familiar from the United States context. There's a organization called StoryCorps that does a particular form of interviews that gets into sort of personal motivations and why people do the work they do, and is one way to build empathy and perhaps provide a space to talk frankly to where things don't go well. And that was a direct follow-up to some of the needs that were surfaced in this report. There will be others, I hope. And I also hope that we'll get concrete suggestions from you. So because we haven't figured it out, I think it needs to be very much a two-way dialogue between funders and grantees on how to test things and do this in a safe way. So we have a couple of framing questions at the end that I hope spark discussion, and we want to save most of the time for that. So I'm going to pause there and hand back to Jed, and I may add one more minute in a second around story purposes, but I'd rather let Jed frame where we're going, and then he's going to lead us through the bulk of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Michael. In the germinal conversations about this report, Michael and I were discussing the tension between a great desire to show impact in the work of TAI's donor members and more broadly across the social sector. How do we use stories to persuade people, to show the impact of our work, to promote our work? And then the fact that there's another kind of use of stories and information and results that is a bit more pedestrian, but equally important, having to do with the transactional nature of grant making, the use of reporting, and in fact, the use of evaluation, and whether you call it monitoring and evaluation and learning, monitoring, evaluation, research and learning, adaptive learning. We are using stories, we are digging into the work we have done to learn, and we are using stories to do so. And one of the themes you'll see in the report is that those two activities are somewhat siloed, which can create duplication and replication. But in our planning to do this research, we set about to ask, what do the donor members of TAI and their grantees, what do they want from stories, and what do they want in particular from stories of results? How are they going about getting it? As a longtime communications officer at several large and small organizations, I was keenly aware of the number of times people would come into my office and say, do we have a story about how tax justice yielded development outcomes? And I'm sure anyone who's done this kind of work is struggling with that all the time. You say, oh, wait, I heard about something, or let's use that same link from our blog from last year. And figuring out how to support donors to do better and how to teach donors to do better for themselves in that question of tracking results, but also maybe helping them to teach themselves to do a little better in terms of what counts as a result and what kind of storytelling and story gathering activity is already happening that they might be able to learn about and do better with. How does that work fit into the larger enterprise of grant makers and their work with their grantees? Michael, do you want to say anything else about sort of the needs going in? You might be on mute.
Sorry, yes. Only I think those bullets capture it, but just to put a little bit of color on it, what it really means is there's certainly a pressure on the funder side to report to their own boards and for their own accountability, and that tends to gear itself to wanting to hear the successes. And so there are shifts about what might be mechanisms to also force those boards to hear and reflect on where things have not gone so well. And one of our members, for example, each director has to bring a story like of the biggest failing grant, like which grant was the biggest disaster, which sounds a little facetious, but I think you have to take some of those steps that sort of are a little forced in order to then find a sort of happy medium where these things can be surfaced more regularly. And Jed will talk more to that problem of stories of failure trickling up in a minute. the other main focus is on, they have a clear interest in evidence and what's working and what's not. So, that need to think about which you need both sides of this, what works well and what doesn't in that. And that should inform, not to be critiquing and like cutting off grants, but that's to inform adaptation of strategies and approaches. And perhaps most importantly, it's to inform how they can be more supportive of the grantees. So what else would need to be in place in order to increase the chances of success, and how can they reflect together on what those support mechanisms could be. So so that's just a little flesh on the bones of those bullets, but I think with that we should probably dig in. Just my last word would be that I think there's a particular urgency for those of us working on transparency and accountability, as in this group, that is shared on the funder side. Like if we're proponents of transparency and accountability, that should extend to having a willingness to be transparent about opening up on our own work. And so this, it should be implicit and explicit in how we think and how we operate. So with that, Jed, I'm back to you to walk us through the findings.
Thanks so much. And I will say, as an introduction to the document that's available from the TAI website, and at the link at the bottom of this page, the bit.ly link, page 11 of the report actually has a longer version of the slide we just showed, the different uses that we see groups using, making of stories and of results and of outcome stories. So this is the report. You can find it at the link below at TA Initiative. And these are the different groups of people we spoke to. We didn't want to only speak to the donors and program officers. We spoke to several CSOs in the grantee community, as well as people who have expertise in use of story for learning. The co-author, Alison Miranda of TAI, is the TAI learning officer and was essential in the shaping of the report, and in particular the thinking about how our findings could be framed as most usable to people thinking about learning and adaptive learning. We also spoke to people on the communications side at donors and grantees, and to a few storytelling experts as well, who I'll mention as we go. These were the questions we went in with, derived from Michael and Alison's conversations with their donor members and from my own experiences thinking about making stories not only available, not only collecting them, but how to make them more usable and accessible and shareable. So I will tell you about our key findings and then a little bit about the recommendations we've come up with so far. The first two findings, I should say one other thing, which is just that you'll hear me talk about breaking silos and the fact that we are collecting information for multiple reasons and perhaps sometimes working duplicatively. I'm not trying to flatten that out and believe that there is one time to collect results, and then results should simply be mined and reformatted serially from the same pool. Sometimes we have to go back. The questions about evaluation are different than the questions that a writer of an annual report or of a blog post or of a YouTube video would ask. However, there is some extent that we can maximize our harvesting and the accuracy and the authenticity of our stories by thinking about where there is overlap and duplication between our efforts. So some of the things that we found will not be surprising to anyone who's done some of this work in this sector, that we have a lot of information lying around in our programs and in our research, but not all of it counts as a story. That is a challenge. If you have something that is very, very important, but doesn't have a narrative around it, sometimes it's harder to get it out there, especially in our attention deficit media climate. And that to solve that problem often requires surrogate skills, capacitation of smaller organizations in the Global South, perhaps with funding or additional follow-on funding or surrogate support. Now, all of these are expected, but they also create some challenges in that attempt to solve capacity problems that we'll talk about in a second. What we learned, some of the things we learned were new to us and interesting to synthesize. The idea that we talk about seeking results stories, but we have a somewhat narrow definition of what victory looks like, and we might be missing a lot of wonderful information if we look at partial results, interim results, not to mention failures. We've all been in the situation where the grant is up for renewal. You go to your donor your program officer, you say, well, we did pretty well, and here's what we've learned, and here's what we'd like to do with the next grant. But it's more difficult to say all our results are partial. We learned how much we don't know yet, and help us think together about what we actually want to do next. That is a harder conversation to have, but sometimes a truer conversation, and sometimes a better use of both money and future time in terms of learning and helping the people that so many grantees programs are designed to help. We learned that silos in organizational culture, in particular at the donor level, but also at the grantee level, between program operatives, field operatives on the one hand, and communications folks or grant making folks on the other, and then the people who come in later to do evaluation, or the people within the donor organization who run evaluations as a third, and that those internal bulkheads between our work are making it harder and harder to make stories, to gather and put together stories. We can tell a great story, but the process of making it may require some collaboration over the cubicles and down the hall, and perhaps even in another office. And that does not always happen. And thirdly, as you've heard us allude to already, and as I'm sure anyone who's participated in some of these other webinars has spoken about, it's hard to talk about difficulty. Bad news does not travel well. And what we think of as bad news is something that we need to question more strongly. So basically, we saw that there are some challenges of content that are somewhat familiar, challenges of capacity, such as what does it take to collect a story? I had one grantee in the report say, I have a small organization. We have to file quarterly reports with the Internal Revenue Service. If it's a choice between blogging about my most recent activity, which is a great story, and writing my Internal Revenue Service reports, I always have to choose to write my reports. So that's capacity is a challenge. And then storytellers not always available. But it's not only the high and low capacity to tell a story. Sometimes you need to, fly in somebody to, someone with journalistic skills to your grant location. Sometimes there's also challenges that you're doing intensive policy work, and that policy work doesn't always lend itself to easy stories. We had one interviewee say to us, researchers do not like to be edited. Our stories sometimes aren't just trapped in longer reports or PDFs. Sometimes our stories are trapped in PhDs as well. And then most importantly, I think we came across challenges of culture. And these are the three subcategories you'll find in the report: content, capacity, and culture. And regionally, a donor is in one country and a grantee is often in another. So there are some cultural challenges to knowing what story to tell and how best to capture it. There are challenges of organizational culture. Isabel mentioned, there are times when you're not sure how to start a conversation with donors, or internal to organizations. Sometimes there's an internal accountability issue where how do program officers and even their directors report properly to their boards. There are also, and this is implied there too, challenges of power. How easy is it to tell the truth upward? And then there's a culture of grant making itself that is somewhat highly structured, highly transactional, and does not always lend itself to asking the kind of questions that would bring out the nuance where the greatest learning or the most authentic truths, or sometimes even the most lovely stories, are. So these challenges of content, capacity, and culture surround the basic challenge of finding and telling a good story, which we also get into a little bit on page 14 of the report. Some good advice just about how to make your story shine. And this story making challenge is the activity that we've identified as a real place of opportunity. I should add that not all of these problems are solvable. Some are built into the structure of the work, and we need to learn more about those dynamics and to understand. And several of the donors in TAI have recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, created offices of strategy and learning, offices of grant making support that are looking into these dynamics and trying to help their own colleagues to learn more effectively and to use stories in that effort. So none of these problems are immediately solvable, but we want to share a few of the ideas we've had since the findings of the report, and building on the recommendations at the end of the report about the importance about how to improve the story making process. So we've talked about the diversity of outcomes and how there's stories in unlikely places. It doesn't just have to be a story of pulling the sword from the stone and becoming the ruler of the kingdom or the improver of stockout problems in East Africa, pharmaceutical stockouts. We've talked about the fact that local storytellers are sometimes the best way to get the most authentic story, and also get around some of the power dynamics that you may struggle with when you're sort of telling someone's story for them and reducing the truth and possibly even replaying some of the negative and even colonial dynamics of storytelling between grantees and donors, particularly between the global north and south. We talked about the fact that we need to bridge silos and collaborate and learn sooner. If an evaluation is conducted 2 years after the core of your activity, you may have lost a chance to tell a great story, and you also may have already renewed the grant and you're throwing slightly worse money after good money, and the money could have been improved if you'd learned more. And as we said, there's a cultural challenge and you need to allow bad news to travel. So those were our findings and some of our recommendations. There are many different kinds of outcomes. We need to collect them all. We need to be open to them and perhaps even change our structural processes to allow for the diversity of outcomes that we see in our work, and interim outcomes, and the idea of midstream adjustments in grants, so as to turn a failure into an opportunity. We also talked about the fact that too often we're missing the story and missing a chance to empower the very groups we're trying to empower, to collaborate with them as equals, and that it's important to let the groups, small CSOs, grantees, and the beneficiaries of those grantees tell their own stories, because we may miss the story otherwise. We need to do better listening differently. We need to be creative and humble and even uncomfortable about what we, particularly as donors, are ready to hear and what we think counts as an outcome. And we need to hand over the microphone. It's a capacity challenge, certainly in some cases where your small CSO or your local beneficiaries don't have the capacity to tell their stories in as elegant or attractive a way as you might like for your annual report. But we believe that we need to push hard at this challenge, and groups like StoryCorps that Michael just mentioned are doing exactly that. And there are risks if we do not do that. There are risks if we tell stories for groups, and in particular, in a transparency and accountability frame. If we want to know what actually happened in our work, we want to try to err, I would say, on the bottom-up storytelling side. And we talked about the habits that make us do our work in our cubicles, and our fundraising officers and grant makers and grant report readers aren't always the same people as our communications officers, or our bloggers, and aren't the same as our program people, and aren't the same as our advocacy people, and aren't the same as the people who then do the evaluations later, sometimes 2 years later. So this diagram appears in the report and reflects our wish that, our belief that if we could consult more across these different streams of advocacy, publication, communications, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning, we would actually have more diverse, richer, more informative stories that would make each of our work stronger. And lastly, the cultural challenge that bad news does not travel upward well. When something happened that we didn't expect or wish had not, whether it's a failure or just an unexpected, we need to find ways to permit that information to move upward and outward, and to make that a natural part of our storytelling work and of our programmatic work in grantee offices and in donor offices and in collaboratives like this, like the TAI or Accountable Now, which reach across organizations and try to make more complex conversations safer to have back when we go home. So in sum, to help failure to inform our grant making work and our storytelling work, we want to broaden our definitions of what counts as an outcome. We want to talk more and more often with each other. We want to try to reach downward and let groups tell their own stories, permit them to reach upward, if you will. And we also want to allow bad news to move upward and outward more safely, whether that's between Dar es Salaam and London or Washington, or even between the office I'm sitting at the moment on the 6th floor of the Open Society Foundation and another floor of the Open Society Foundation. one other thing about failure, we are not recommending failure. We don't encourage anyone to fetishize failure. Michael talked about that. Failure is having its own hype cycle. Failure has been very successful recently, but I don't think that will last. But we are encouraging groups to understand failure as vital project intelligence and to break out of the dualism between success and failure and embrace a more a gardener's or a shopper's notion of all the different things, the diversity of outcomes, results, and partial results that can truly inform our work and that may be our keyholes, may be our paths to the richest and most informative and often most retellable stories. So as Michael mentioned, we want to turn it over back for some discussion, and these are the questions that we thought we could start with, but we are of course keen for your questions and your feedback as well.